In Canada, the prison system disproportionately affects Indigenous and Black Canadians. 31% of the prison population identifies as Indigenous, which is not proportionate to the population of Canada, where Indigenous people make up only 5%. In this way, the correctional system in Canada almost functions as an institution not unsimilar to residential schools. Prisoners are pressured on the basis of receiving basic necessities, or to not be placed in solitary confinement, to join labor programs such as Corcan. Working for Corcan, prisoners are making products for the Canadian government for very little pay. Therefore, if we look down the line of systematic oppression, Black and Indigenous people of color are being disproportionately imprisoned and then pressured into cheap labor for the government. This is why racial oppression is such an important part of the discussion about the prison system.
There are multiple reasons that people of color are more likely to end up in prison in Canada. Firstly, countless examples show that for the same crime committed by a person of color and a white person, the punishment will not always be the same. On average, Black men who commit the same crime as white men will have a sentence that is 20% longer. In the United States, since a Supreme Court ruling in 2005, judges have had more allowance in making decisions to include their own personal opinion when it comes to sentencing, which makes it easier for them to inflict their own biases. Due to systematic racism, there are far more white judges than judges of color, and psychology shows that everyone has implicit bias when it comes to race. Another reason why there are a disproportionate amount of people of color in prison is because of the systematic racism in our society that leads young people into prisons. Systemic and institutional racism makes it harder for people of color to rise in socioeconomic status, keeping them at the bottom. There are more obstacles for people of color when it comes to getting a further education that would lead to more opportunities. This potentially leads to more opportunities for crime, but once again, even small offenses would lead to longer sentences for people of color. Policies and infrastructure in place are designed for the incarceration of people of color.
In the United States, the school-to-prison pipeline shows how the rate of suspensions and expulsion for Black students is disproportionately higher. The school system mirrors the legal system in the way that a white student would not be suspended or expelled for the same offense that a Black student would be suspended or expelled for. Schools in the United States and in Canada have opted to have police officers in schools. Having police officers in schools raises the rate of students being arrested and turned over to the juvenile justice system. And due to the racial bias of officers being primarily white and the way in which the school system lowers academic expectations for Black students and labels them as more dangerous, arrests in schools affect Black students disproportionately more than white students, which contributes to the school-to-prison pipeline. In Canada, and specifically in Kingston, the Indigenous population in prisons is significant. In this episode, we will hear from Carol Sr. about personal experiences with the Indigenous population she interacted with and learned from in Kingston's prisons.
I was concerned for the individuals that I got to know.
Yeah.
Like I went to the Native Brotherhood meetings and learned a lot about the prisoners who were there, who were Indigenous. They would have socials in the gym every quarter. They were called a change of seasons. Mm-hmm. And they would have visitors come into that, and they would serve Indigenous food. I got to know a lot of them gradually. And I believe at that time, Indigenous people made up something like 4% of our population, the Canadian population. And in some parts of the country, 50% of prisoners were Indigenous. Clearly there's something wrong.
Yeah.
Something's really wrong. And there were other, there are all kinds of issues that came up like that, segregation and others that we could speak about. The first day I went into prison, I went to the Native Brotherhood. The first day, I was accompanied or taken in by a professor of education that was a dear friend of my husband's, and actually they were family friends. The Hennessy's. Mr. Hennessy took me in. He was a Citizens Advisory Committee member at KP. So he took me to the door of the music room where the Native Brotherhood had their meeting, and knocked on the door and said, "I'll leave you here," and left me. And the door was opened by Henry. And Henry was one of the Native brothers. And he took me, and there was a meeting in progress, and he whispered in my ear what was happening, made me comfortable, brought me a cup of coffee. And then when they finished their formal meeting, they brought out a great big drum, which several of the men sat around with their toes under the edge of the drum. And they invited me to come and sit with them. This was all impromptu. They hadn't planned this. Gave me drumsticks. And they sang and we drummed. And I felt very welcome, and I felt suitably cared for, and it was a perfect way to start in the prison. That beginning was a very good beginning for me, and I continued to be involved with the Native Brotherhood.